Everybody, welcome to the April edition of our Technicolor. I'm Massimo, HIV Prevention and Testing Coordinator at Positive East, and tonight I will be your host. I'm here with our fabulous guests, Alexander Leon and Andre Smith. As many of you know, Technicolor is a monthly LGBT plus film night that started in Redbridge Central Library in 2019 to provide to the LGBT plus community in Redbridge a much needed safe space to get together and be ourselves. When COVID-19 struck in March 2020, we decided to transition the film night online, proposing it every second Monday of the month as a live event on Positive East's Facebook page. So if you are watching this live on Facebook, thanks for tuning in. And please remember to fill in our evaluation online, clicking on the link in the comments. And let us know of any film or subject discussion that you would like us to cover. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe our channel. So for tonight, let me tell you before a little bit about Positive East. So Positive East is London's largest community-based HIV charity. We provide support services to people living with HIV who either live or access HIV care in East London. These services include peer support, counseling, group activities, and welfare and benefit advice. We also provide free HIV and STI testing, free condoms, and sexual health advice to people across East London. Since COVID started, we moved all the services from face-to-face to online. So if you are interested in accessing them, please do get in touch in our website, www.positiveeast.org.uk, or by email at prevention@positiveeast.org.uk, or on the live chat with a phone call, calling 02077912855, and then choosing option 3 for sexual health information and advice. And you can also order free condoms from us to be delivered anonymously to your house. And as with most charities, Positive East has had to cancel our regular fundraising events due to the pandemic, meaning that we need support now more than ever. So please take a look at our website and consider supporting us in any way that you can. So the film that we are discussing tonight is the documentary Olly Alexander, Growing Up Gay. That's a documentary that appeared on BBC, and it's available on the iPlayer. And on the documentary, the years and years singer and star of the Channel 4 drama series It's a Sin discusses his personal struggles with his sexual identity and explores the mental health issues faced by members of the LGBT plus community. And here with us to discuss it, we have Alexander Leon, writer and campaigner focused on LGBT plus rights, anti-racism, and mental health. His work on issues such as sexual racism, LGBT plus mental health inequality, and global LGBT plus human rights has been featured in The Guardian, BBC, MTV, The Independent, Huffington Post, and more. And he is currently working with LinkedIn as part of their LinkedIn Changemakers campaign, which connects businesses to activists to encourage change in the world of work. So welcome, Alexander.
Thanks.
And Alexander, during the day, works in comms and campaign and as an inclusion consultant for businesses and NGOs with a focus on intersectional inclusion. And with us tonight, we also have our very own Andre Smith, Counselling Coordinator at Positive East. Prior to Positive East, Andre has worked in the fields of advertising, fashion, interior and garden design, TV and travel. When he joined PE in August 2010 as an African communities outreach worker, the contract was for 6 months, and 11 years later, 10 of which he has been a qualified psychotherapeutic counselor, he now leads our counseling service, delivering face-to-face counseling support to positivist clients and managing and coordinating a team of 12 volunteers counselors. Additionally, he leads twice weekly meditation sessions for clients and staff, and more recently, he has embarked on a year-long mindfulness teacher training course at Oxford University. So welcome, Andre, as well. Welcome to you both, and thank you for joining me. So I have a few questions for you. Feel free to answer in the order that you guys prefer. So the first one is, if both of you could please tell us more about yourselves and what you are working at the moment. Shall we start with Alexander?
Sure. So what am I working on at the moment? I mean, I feel like I'm just surviving. I feel like I'm focusing on surviving at the moment in, what has obviously been a pretty difficult time for all of us. So I've actually taken a big step back to my normal work. So most of my work normally is writing. I just do a lot of writing, and I write on I guess, news issues and issues that pertain to kind of LGBT people and LGBT people of color. But one of my biggest goals over this past year, particularly when the pandemic hit, was to focus a little bit more on my mental health. And I realized that in constantly wanting to platform other people and write about other people and kind of, wave the flag about LGBT mental health, which is a really, a topic that I have a lot of passion about, I was kind of compromising my own mental health, right? By kind of obsessing over trying to, make the government listen and sort of, spread awareness. So I guess my biggest thing over the last 12 months has really been to practice what I preach and pivot towards caring for myself first and sort of caring for my community secondarily whilst we're in this particularly difficult time. But how am I filling my days? I work 3 days a week freelance, doing comms and campaigns for a agency which does kind of inclusive and representative campaigns for different health organizations. And otherwise, I'm trying to write a novel with difficulty, I must say, but I'm trying. So that's kind of, that's a summary of what I've been up to recently.
Wow, interesting. I'm looking forward to read the novel.
If it ever happens, if it ever comes into fruition, we'll see.
And Andre.
I think my own activities may sound a little dull after that very interesting introduction from Alexander. A little bit more about me. What can I say? I like long walks and fried chicken. I live in on the boundary between Soho and Covent Garden. I've been in this square mile for like 25 years plus. So I love living in Metropolis, love the energy of it. And when it gets all too much, I go off and stay in a monastery for a week. That's my sort of well-being retreat. What else can I tell you? I live with my partner, Stephen, and we may soon be 3, not because either of us are expecting, but there may be a dog coming soon. Yay. So very exciting. Yeah, exactly. As you mentioned, I'm currently enrolled on a year-long mindfulness teacher training project with Oxford University. So once I'm at the end of that, what I'll be doing with what I've learned is organizing and setting up some MBCT, as in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for life courses, which can be anything from 6 to 8 weeks. And they will be available to our clients and perhaps also to clients of our sort of partnership organizations as well. Mindfulness is quite a big thing at the moment. I think it's here to stay. It's more than a fad. And I think something I've been interested in for a long, long time, even before it began to hit the headlines. and I use it in my own work as a therapist. I practice it. So I think this is something that has wheels and is going to go into the future and not save mankind, but, you know, be a, a close second. I think at work at the moment, I'm just working on expanding the platforms on which we offer counselling. Prior to COVID, BC, as they say, which now means before COVID. Used to have
no, that's the first time I've heard that. Oh God.
Yeah, we just offered face-to-face sessions in the building, so people would come in and use the counselling rooms with the counsellors. But we were forced almost overnight to sort of get everything online, as it were. So that was quite a challenge. But the upshot of that, of course, has meant that we've now expanded all the platforms on which we're able to offer counselling. And for some people, it really suits them. They don't have to struggle on transport and come to the building and then find their way home. So we now offer counselling sort of online with Skype or Zoom or WhatsApp. Some people like telephone if they don't like the online sort of thing. So as well as the face-to-face, which we will continue as soon as the drawbridges are fully down again and we're all allowed back into sort of normal life. So that's really what I'm working on. It's interesting as well, because some of the clients have already sort of said, can I stay online? You know, so these new platforms will be here to stay. So that's kind of it, I think, for the moment.
Well, you started saying that it was less interesting.
I know, right? I was like, you were like, yeah, you know, just going to a mindfulness course at Oxford University another day. I was like, all right.
Always undersell.
Anyway, let's delve into the documentary that is the object of today's get together. So I will start asking you guys. So Olly starts the documentary saying that he never met a gay person who grew up unscathed by being gay, and that he wants to explore the link between being gay and being sad and low. What do you think is this link he's talking about? Who wants to start?
I mean, I can start if you want.
Go ahead, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think this is really interesting because I kind of agree. I mean, I know very few people. In fact, I find it quite strange when I come across someone who has grown up LGBT plus and it's like, I am perfectly well adjusted in every way. I'm like, how? You know, I think we live in a world which, you know, although it's getting better, a world which for a very long time has pushed down and tried to silence and oppress queer or LGBT people in various different forms. In terms of the link between those two things, I think for me, it's not that being gay in the essence of itself leads to poor mental health. I think that's really important because I think that's also an attack line that we've gotten for many years, right? That to be gay must mean, I mean, it was only fairly recently that homosexuality was taken out of the list of, you know, psychiatric disorders, right? But I think for me, it's not about being gay, it's about, or being queer or being LGBT plus. It's about the closet. It's about the experience of holding in who you actually are, right? And of not allowing yourself to be authentic. And that certainly for me was the case, right? When I think back to my most difficult mental health struggles, they weren't about the fact that I was gay. Being gay wasn't itself a problem. It was the fact that the world around me and the people around me seemed to have a problem with it, which I then internalized as myself having a problem with it. So I think it's a really tough thing. I think the more and I think we're seeing this very, very slowly, but the more that we create a society where, you know, queerness and being LGBT is celebrated in all its different forms, we see young people now sometimes kind of like sidestepping the experience of the closet and kind of being like, oh, I was always out. And I feel like that is a much more positive place to be coming from in terms of, you know, developing a better sense of self and a kind of stronger sense of who you are. But I think for me, it was always a closet. When I think back to the worst times in my life from a mental health perspective, it was always a closet. And it was those times where I was kind of struggling to get out. And then also the period of, you know, people always think that you come out and then you're like, great, see you later, I'm gay now, woo. And it's not like that, right? We all know that you come out of the closet and you're still hanging on to all of these internalized feelings about who you are and your worth and your value and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, basically the closet.
yeah, that's a good point, actually. Yeah, I did. I didn't think about it, but actually it's the closet that defines more our view of the world than being gay in itself and the problems that carries with it. It's more like, yeah, the closet makes much more sense. Would you like to add anything, Andre?
Well, yeah, I think that's some really interesting points made there, and I think being gay by itself does not make you sad or low or give you mental health issues. However, there's still, I think, considerably high number of LGBT plus people who experience sort of sadness or low mood is, I would say, very much linked to those mostly, well, the early and mostly negative messages and opinions that we begin to hear from a really early age. And those messages come from family, they come from friends and peers, from culture, society, religion, media. It's a long, long list that tell us that somehow being gay is wrong. That's the essential message still for and the perception of people, that you're not somehow normal, that your difference is not to be celebrated, but rather to be feared, to be joked about, to be ridiculed, attacked, mocked, judged, criticized, something you should feel shamed about. And I think, you know, growing up and finding your identity and finding your way into life and through life is hard enough for any individual. So it's no wonder that most gay people are disproportionately affected by mental health issues like depression when you consider those challenges, and that's, you know, bias, stigma, the fear of disclosure, of being outed, the finger pointing, the potential rejection, the subtle and blatant homophobia, the psychological, emotional, and sometimes even physical abuse that young and older gay people still have to endure on a daily basis. And these are challenges that people who are not gay do not have to give a second's thought to, because they're sent an entirely different set of messages that support the so-called normative. You know, and it's interesting, isn't it, that heterosexuality is seen as natural and being gay is still perceived by many as somehow being a sort of sinful lifestyle choice. So I think these messages that straight is normal and gay isn't, is really why so many LGBT plus people that I've worked with have had deep issues of low self-esteem, because they believe on some level that maybe they're not natural, or that something is wrong with them because they're unable to choose to be straight. A lot of people think that it's a chosen lifestyle. And if your first introduction to your sexuality is that it's wrong and you have to hide it, then really little wonder that many LGBT people experience so many of those things we've already talked about.
I think it's also, I mean, that was like the best answer ever, but I also think that one of the things that I've always found really interesting from my own lived experience and just the experience of people around me, like LGBT people around me and in my life, is that negative kind of I'm not good enough, like thought spiral or whatever you want to call it, which is obviously related to your sexuality or your, you know, femininity or whatever it may be, ends up replicating itself in other areas of your life, right? Because you learn this kind of one way of thinking about yourself. I'm not good enough, I'm not good enough, I'm not good enough. And then even when you liberate yourself from the closet and even when you come out, you still have that kind of repeated message going on in your mind. So then all of a sudden you're at work and, you know, you've got to do a big presentation and it's your brain defaults to I'm not good enough, I'm not good enough, I'm not good enough. And it's these kind of like, you know, legacy thoughts from growing up, hearing all these messages and being closeted or whatever it may be. And I sometimes think that that's not always given the time it deserves, right? That yes, we hear all these horrible messages about being gay growing up, but they have a lasting impact on every other, like every single aspect of our lives. It's not just that we come out of the closet and we're good to go, right? We're fully well adjusted and we're great. I feel like that's something that often straight cis people don't fully clock, right? It's like it's long-term stuff and it sticks with you for a really long time.
I think it's a bit like I think that's a very well observed point, like a sort of domino effect. You know, and it's not exclusive. That sort of low self-esteem is not just exclusive to sexuality. Of course it isn't. So you're right. You might sort of feel like, and it comes up in sessions when I work with people, you know, I thought I was okay with, you know, made peace with being gay and everything, but still, as you say, you know, one request or something can just trigger that sort of deep-seated unworthiness, as it were. So, you know, spend a lot of time in sessions sort of unpacking this. You have to go quite deep to unpack this and help people understand its ripple effect.
Yeah, that's a very good point to say that being repeated over and over again that you're not good enough, it gets deep into your mental health, and it's difficult to unpick all the damage that is done in years and years of repeating this same message. Yeah, that's really true. So next question. When Olly interviews Connor, they talk about bullying at school and how Connor felt like he couldn't talk about it with anybody, not even with his best friend Georgina, who was secretly LGBT plus as well. And that led him to have suicidal thoughts. What can be done to avoid that LGBT plus young people go through what Connor experienced? In your opinions?
Go on, Andre. I went first last time.
I think so much of the challenges we face, you know, on an A to Z of life, and where we get stuck comes down to lack of education in the broadest terms, and the earlier the better. And I think that early educational support, not just in school, but within the family and community settings that start to normalize being gay are really, really important, because that just makes space for a much more positive dialogue about sexual orientation and or exploration. And I think that in that kind of setting, it just allows the person to sort of feel valued and take ownership and be proud of what they are, rather than having to feel they've got to kind of hide it or keep it a secret, you know, something about them that in actuality, something about them they feel is wrong, that in actuality is perfectly, perfectly natural. So I think, as I said before, you know, being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or other is not in itself a problem or a risk for young people. The problem arises when other people, and that might be in our communities, you know, teachers, doctors, parents, families, friends, youth workers, faith leaders, other straight people, they respond negatively to the fact that somebody might be lesbian or gay or bisexual. So I think that true change takes time and it's generational. You know, that's why I say, you know, the earlier you start with education, the better. But, you know, as society, you know, I don't want to sort of sound like a doomsday merchant, because there's so much to celebrate in terms of, you know, the advancements and everything. But I'm just sort of speaking more from the people I see and I work with. And so these issues are really still there. And of course, not every LGBT person is going to have around them people who are ready to accept, you know, their sexual orientation, or be supportive. So thus they start to feel isolated and alone and worry about the consequences of coming out. So I think it's equally important, not just for early education, but also that young LGBT people in particular are really aware of the support that is out there. Because if it's not in their immediate locale, in their immediate surroundings, they might just feel there's no help. And actually, a quick Google, help me, I'm gay, you'll be surprised the wealth of information and support and organizations that are out there, national, local, and all that sort of stuff. So I think that it's important, like I said, that the messages come early, and that being gay is as normal as being a vegetarian now. You know?
Some of us are both.
yeah, exactly. Or both. Yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, some of older generations, I think that the truth of the matter, I feel, is that their biases will die out with them, as it were. I'm not wishing death on anybody, so please don't misinterpret what I'm saying. But I think it's generational, and it truly takes time. So there is great stuff that's happening, but also lasting change can be sort of slower. But I think it's most effective with you know, younger people. As Nana Cherry sang, you know, when a child is born, it has no concept of the tone of skin it's living in, you know. So children come into the world as these beautiful, blank, open canvases. They don't know there's anything wrong with difference or color or even sexuality until they're told. So if you get in there early, that's where you begin to really change the world.
Yeah.
I'm like Andre for president. That was incredible. How do I follow that? Well, I mean, I guess I sort of connect to this question, or I relate to this question in the sense that, you know, I was a young person you know, not that long ago. And I did struggle with suicidal thoughts. In fact, I attempted suicide when I was 19. So I think this particular question and this topic is something which, you know, I feel like I have a kind of lived experience of feeling, you know, deeply unhappy and deeply troubled in relation to my sexuality, and then, you know, wanting to go so far as to end my life on that basis. When I think back to, you know, what could have helped, or what could have changed me, what could have changed that situation, I think, you know, as Andre was saying, a lot of it is around representation, but I think it's also about, like, you know, representation within representation. So like honest representation and diverse representation. I think often the LGBT community, for a long time, we've kind of taken what we can get when it comes to representation, because it has been such a sort of slow and incremental change. But I think, you know, for a very long time, I think the large, you know, a large amount of representation that we've had has been white gay men and white lesbian women, right? There's been very little trans representation and very little representation of people of color. And as like a young brown gay boy growing up, if I was to look at gay men who I could, there was no gay men in the spotlight in the mainstream media that I could relate to in any way whatsoever. I think that's changing. And as Andre said, you know, some of this is about the kind of natural progression of society towards, you know, being more just and being more equal and being more fair. And I do think that we are seeing much more diverse representation, which is amazing, right? We're seeing people in music, in film, in sports, who are all different, you know, all kind of colors of the LGBT rainbow, who are now kind of in the spotlight and being seen as role models and people to look up to and people to kind of want to emulate. So I think that has a big role to play, representation. I also just think, there is something about representation in schools. I think, for example, when I look back to my school days, there was a lot of LGBT people, both on the staff and in the kind of students. But amongst the staff, it was very much like, don't ask, don't tell. Like the students kind of knew, we all kind of knew who the gay teachers were, you know, because sometimes they bring a partner to a school event or whatever, but it was very like, we don't talk about it because it's inappropriate. And it was that their sexuality, or sexuality in general, was seen as inappropriate in a school environment. And I think, you know, when it comes to that particular question, I just think, how magical would it be if we had gay teachers who were like, yeah, I mean, we do have this right now, like, and that's amazing. But if we had just gay teachers who was like, yeah, I'm gay, right? Cool. I have a husband, or I have a wife, or I have a partner, or whatever that may be. I think that has a lot of power over children's perception, right? Because then all of a sudden they have someone, even if they don't have someone in their immediate life, in their, you know, family life, who identifies as LGBT plus, they have someone in their life who they can sort of humanize, right, rather than demonize, and think, oh, that's, you know, well, Mr. whoever it is completely normal and super lovely and my favorite teacher, and he happens to have a partner who's of the same sex, you know, what of it? So yeah, I think representation across the board, but I do think, had I had representation in school when I was growing up, I think it really would have changed my perception of myself, which probably would have changed the kind of course of my life in terms of my poor mental health at that time. So yeah.
Yeah.
I think also, if you are growing up and you hear your early role models or caregivers or whatever start to sort of push back. So when there is sort of blatant discrimination, you know, a young gay kid might hear their parents say, whether they've disclosed or not, that is so wrong, that is not right.
Yeah.
You know, so they have a sort of sense, oh, there is room for me in this world then, actually, you know, it would be lovely to and probably maybe younger people are hearing that now, certainly not when I was at school, you know, if you were gay, you were just sort of a poof, you know, and beaten up and then called Larry Grayson or John Inman for the rest of your life, you know, sort of the early over effeminized sort of gay characters. They were the role models, basically. So I think it's really important, I think, also, you know, if sort of parents and teachers are listening to this, you know, to really not be afraid to stand up and in front of young people, you know, push back and say, no, not acceptable, you know, so young people are seeing others who aren't gay standing up and fighting back.
You know, Andre, I had the weirdest, most mind-boggling conversation with my cousin a couple of years ago. So my cousin's probably a good 10 years younger than me. And at the time she was still in high school. And we were talking about her high school troubles. And she, as far as I know, identifies as straight and cis. But we were talking about her high school troubles, and she was talking about the popular kids at school. And to my complete delight and shock, the two most popular boys in school were a gay couple. And I had to say to her, I was like, I'm so happy. This is just wonderful and brilliant. It obviously shows progress, but it's so hard for me to imagine, because when I grew up, those two things were completely incompatible, right? In my school environment, if you were effeminate or gay in any way, shape, or form, there was no way that you were ever going to be cool. And so I had this kind of moment of like, well, I mean, and actually this story was slightly problematic because she was telling me about how they were kind of bullying someone. I was like, that's not great. But I was like, oh, you know, bittersweet, because the bullying's not good. But, you know, for two gay boys to be the most popular boys in school, I mean, I was just completely flabbergasted by it. And I think that's progress, right? That shows that we're on a path somewhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. It's something that I would never imagine in my school either, also because in Italy you do what the Pope says. It's certainly not an ally for LGBT people. Anyway, next question. Talking with Sean, Olly introduces another issue that affects most gay men, that is chemsex. Olly says that for many gay men, the bar scene is the first introduction to gay life, and for many of them, it is easy to sleep on to a path of self-destruction made of drugs and sex. In your opinions, how does chemsex relate to the struggle to accept our own homosexuality?
Should we do the relay? I think it's you. You can take that.
That bit me back. That did, didn't it? Yeah, I mean, it's such a tough question. I think for me, thinking about chemsex, it's the numbing element of it, right? It's the numbing, and I guess I think that the whole question is interesting, because I think there is something about the gay scene, you know, being an environment in which there is access to alcohol, there is access to drugs, and it's often a hypersexualized environment. And particularly when you're young, and this is certainly my experience, being young and vulnerable and kind of wanting to create community, it is quite easy to sort of deviate from what you sort of want and start to engage in things that you might not have, you know, originally thought you were going to engage in, because you are so desperate for a sense of belonging and so desperate for a sense of community that you end up, you know, oh, we're going to go back to this person's place for a chill out. Oh, what's that? And all of a sudden, you know, you're taking G or whatever, right? And I think for me, I think my experience of this is kind of maybe slightly different, but I think for me, my relationship to this is, as particularly as a young gay person, your relationship to sex is often quite fraught anyway, because it's something that you probably, you know, haven't had very much experience of, or haven't had much education around, because, you know, I don't know about you, I imagine you were the same as me. We had very feeble sex education, and certainly there was no discussion of same-sex intimacy in any way, far from it, right? And so my kind of sexual education was porn, and then going to clubs, right, and meeting guys and, you know, doing whatever. I think sex is a very vulnerable thing, right? It requires a lot of vulnerability from us. It requires us to be comfortable with our bodies, with somebody else. It requires us to ask for things and to communicate. It's, you know, sex is beautiful and it's wonderful, but it can also be difficult and complicated. And for young gay and bisexual men, I think a lot of the time they know that they want it, right? They have the desire, but they have so little to base their knowledge of it on, right? So little to grasp, that things which can numb that experience and can numb the vulnerability that comes with sex make it much easier to engage in, right? And that's certainly been my experience. I wouldn't say that I have I haven't engaged in chemsex and kind of in the way that it's talked about, but I've certainly for a very long time, my first kind of, actually many of my first sexual experiences were with a lot of kind of numbing agents involved, right? Because it was such an intimidating and scary thing for me as someone who didn't feel like I knew what I was doing, was kind of embarrassed, wasn't fully comfortable in my body, kind of didn't know what was expected of me, was worried that I was, you know, doing too much or doing too little. So I think I think it's really difficult, and I think it's something that is, I don't know, I think it's something which has a lot more to do with mental health than we give it credit for. I think we often think of chemsex as a sexual health issue, when actually I think it really is a mental health and a sexual health issue, right? It's kind of a holistically health-related thing. But yeah, those are kind of my reflections, I guess. Andre?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that chemsex is complex, not necessarily complicated. I think it's complex, and its use and effects are far-reaching. And it's interesting though, because I think that as well as bars, I think that hookup apps are serving and not always as helpfully as the first introduction for many young LGBT people, as their first introduction to gay life. And for some young gay men who have no other frame of reference to gay culture, may come to equate very quickly sex with chems. You know, that's just what happens, as it were. I'm a dinosaur. I grew up in an era where we went out and bars and clubs, and you sort of refined your social skills, and it was almost a bit sort of high school, like, oh god, that guy over there's looking at you, he fancies you, and it was all very exciting and nervy, and you still relied on some sort of numbing agent, but usually alcohol, just to have the courage to, you know, snog someone or go and talk to them, as it were. But that's sort of all gone. So where a lot of guys are sort of unknowingly leaping over that stage one and going straight into sort of porn and drugs, as it were, sort of thing. And they haven't had a sort of a softer introduction and a wider introduction to what gay culture is all about. And I mean, I've worked with a lot of guys who tell me that the apps were, for them, were really the doorway into their first sexual experiences with another guy, as you just said, yeah. And because so many of them, the people they met up with, used chems, they just assumed that that's what gay men did, and they began to associate chems with the pleasure principle of gay sex. You know, so, but that's not the whole story by any means. And I think chemsex and the reasons behind it are really varied. Most, I think, gay men's involvement with chemsex kind of begins from a sort of seeking pleasure, shall we say. And pleasure, if you want to define it, it's defined as a sort of positive feedback mechanism that motivates us to repeat an action, which, if it's not necessarily altogether healthy, can set us up into that rocky road of addiction and dependence. You know, we're looking for that same hit again and again and again. And I think, as well as the reward of sexual physical pleasure, chemsex can, clients repeatedly tell me, they of course have this reward. It gives a sense of bonding, of belonging, and of identity. So especially if a young guy is shy or not very confident or feeling lonely or isolated, hey, here's a drug that can make you feel like you belong. It blows away all your usual boundaries, dissolves your day-to-day difficulties, and you can finally express your sense of adventure and curiosity. So others see chems, and what I'm talking about here, it's not, this is what my clients tell me, you know, it's like I say, it's so interesting. I think others see chem use as a kind of status. So whether that's as a sort of couple or part of a group that sees itself as sexually adventurous, you know, so it's kind of like, oh, we've got this really cool group going on, you know, and I sort of belong there. I think, however, though, whilst crystal meth can give people sexual confidence and allows them to let go of their boundaries, it doesn't and cannot solve all those underlying issues that we've touched upon already, and that self-stigmatization, low self-worth, loneliness, depression, low libido, erectile dysfunction, that many gay men report as feeling or experiencing, especially when the chems wear off. So one client said to me, I said, how would you describe chemsex? What's your experience of it? And he said, it's a shortcut to sexual paradise, which I thought was quite well put, actually. But as with all drugs, it wears off, and we're delivered back to the very self who's probably we're trying to escape from. You know, so it's not a panacea that's going to take care of everything, and we have to go back. But what it can do, I think, another way it serves is it can numb difficult feelings, which is very often a sort of avoidance, I guess, behaviour. And many guys I've worked with, they sort of say how difficult it is to go back to having sex without drugs once they've used chems. You know, And it's very challenging in my work to help someone to unlearn the connection between strong substances and sexuality and identity after a long history of chemsex. So, like I say, it's kind of complex, and it's sort of relevant at lots of stages. But I think what I've learned as a counsellor is that the support services that may be there with chemsex, they need to focus on each person's specific issues. You can't say, oh, this person's got chemsex, what's the protocol for that? You know, what do we do for them? It's never really about sex, and it's never about the chems. It's usually about the person who is trying to escape or avoid emotional intimacy and honesty. You know, so I'm coming from a counsellor's point of view, because, you know, that's what I do. So, and I think when I'm exploring the ramifications of chemsex with clients, the sessions tend to go way beyond just looking at drug issue. We actually end up looking underneath that, which is really about self-worth and identity and relationships and how to have them and what sober sex means and the anxiety around intimacy. So yeah, I think it's very layered, and it's quite sort of complex, and people have very, very different reasons for using them.
I also think the hookup app thing that you said is so spot on. Like hookup apps were my first introduction to gay culture. So that meant that my first introduction to gay culture was super sexual, right? It was, you know, sex was first, and that was kind of what I thought being gay meant for a long time, was that I was expected to sort of hook up. There was this whole thing around like the top or bottom binary, and that I had to know what that was, and I had to know where I landed on that scale. And, you know, despite having like never really had sex before, I had to know what I wanted. I had to know, you know, all of these things that really contribute to anxiety around sex. We you know, Grindr is not real life, right? But I think if you're an 18-year-old or a 16-year-old young gay man, to you it is real life, because you don't know any different. And I think that's the problem, is that, you know, people are seeing hookup apps and hookup apps are normalizing as kind of, I guess, the real life to these people who then go out into the real world and they sort of operate as if they're on a hookup app, right? Which is, I guess, fine in certain spaces, but is not necessarily what being gay is all about, right? It's a part of, if you want, it's a part of being gay. But yeah, it's really interesting. I also think that hookup apps have kind of become the sex ed of, like, it's like, you know, slap up sex ed for young queer folks. And I just don't know whether that's brilliant, right? That's not their function. That's not what they're there for. But that's kind of their secondary function for a lot of young people. It's like, oh, this is what sex should look like for me, and therefore I'm going to operate on this basis, rather than a more holistic and more kind of human picture of what sex can be and what sex should be, perhaps.
I think you're right. I think these young guys can sort of construct a sort of artificial identity around them as what it means to be gay as a result of their experiences through the app world.
Yeah, I totally agree. And this brings us to our next question. Self-harm is a recurrent topic on this documentary, and it can assume different forms. As you said, addiction can also be a form of self-harm, as hurting oneself, or trying to take one's life, and in the documentary, we see also other forms that affect the LGBT community, like bulimia, in the case of Olly himself and Tom, another of his interviewees. So on that subject of self-harm, do you know what is on offer in London for those who are seeking help with these issues? We heard on the video about this bulimia self-help group for gay men, but do you know of any other service that we can suggest for people who is having these issues?
Is it my turn for the bathroom?
Yeah, can be.
I don't know. Is it? I
don't know. It is.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, self-harm, body dysmorphia, eating disorders, these are actually alarmingly regular themes and topics that come into the counselling sessions and I work with gay men, young and older actually. And, you know, these are issues, they're usually a sign that something is deeply, profoundly upsetting, you know, in someone's life, and they don't necessarily know how to talk about it or what to do about it. And very much so people are left feeling sort of powerless. And when we feel powerless, there's so much evidence to show, you know, we can start adopting unhealthy coping strategies that give the illusion of control. So, you know, I don't know how to deal with all these emotions and all this sort of stuff. So, but what I can control is the food I eat, you know, and or some beyond control. There's this sort of the self-harming is linked into I don't deserve, you know. So and others sort of say it's a sort of form of relief. You know, in Victorian times, they used to sort of bleed you, didn't they? You know, as a sort of, oh, the patient will feel better. But yeah, there's these mechanisms, I think, that people adopt to give them a sense of being somehow in control. And I mean, the body dysmorphia as well, you can link that into the age we live in, of perfect images, you know, and as much as it's with the Kardashians, it's in the gay community, you know, you've got to have perfect skin and perfect hair and perfect teeth and perfect abs and perfect everything. And, you know, incredible and unattainable and immense pressures on young people. And if you just feel you can't live up to that, you know, it's just too much. But in terms of support, anyway, I shouldn't go too much into the sort of psycho behind it, but psychology. But I think in terms of support, I would say the first thing is, you know, if you're struggling with this and you want help, don't forget the first and probably one of the most practical things you can do is go to your GP and ask for help. Your GP can link you into, I'm sure, all sorts of community sort of support programs and organizations that are out there. And I mean, I had this sort of feeling this might sort of come up, you know, and I was just having a brief look, you know, at what was around. And there's organizations, for instance, around harming called harmless.org.uk. And that's recommended by Mind, actually. And that's a user-led organization that supports people who self-harm. And it also supports their friends and their families who can feel powerless in the face of somebody who is hurting themselves or stopping, you know, bulimic or whatever. And then don't forget, there's all the usual kind of organizations. I never know how to pronounce this. Is it Papyrus? I think it's called .org.uk. There's Young Stonewall. There's the Proud Trust. There's the Big White Wall. You've even got the Samaritans. You've got LGBT. God, what's it called? Switchboard. Thank you. Yeah. well guessed there. There's the National Self-Harm Network. There's loads of organizations that are ready to listen and help and support you if you're going through some of this stuff and don't know how to control it, but kind of know you're in trouble. You know, so yeah, I think that there's a glut of organizations and information out there to help people. I think sometimes, again, if you're in the middle of something like that, it can just feel like you're on your own with it. And sometimes people may not want to turn to somebody who's close to them because they might stage an intervention or try and help them in a way that's not going to be helpful. You know, so just going a bit further remotely, you know, going outside that, you know, go to the GP, call one of these organizations who might be able to even link you in with somebody who's more specialist and give you more directive help. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think Andre covered almost everything, basically. I think what I would add is I would obviously always encourage people to go to the GP to be referred on to specialist programs. Those programs tend to be really oversubscribed and difficult to get onto, I say from experience. So I think there are a couple of other options. I know that Matthew Todd in Straight Jacket talks about, I can't remember what it's called, but like 12, I think it's 12-step programs, like that is an option. There are 12-step programs for specific things outside of alcohol addiction and drug addiction. There's like an Overeaters Anonymous. I think there's Anorexia and Bulimics Anonymous. So there are services out there. I think, self-harm generally, as Andre said, is like a manifestation of something else. It's a manifestation of something going on internally. And so I think any mental health service that's available to you, obviously, I would encourage anyone to go to. Some other ones that Andre didn't mention. So London Friend is a really great organization. And also Rainbow Mind, which is quite a new organization. They do courses around radical self-compassion for LGBT people. So it's kind of more preventative stuff. But again, and there's also Mind Out, which is based in Brighton. But there's a wealth of LGBT mental health specific organizations out there. And I think many of them are stretched from a resource perspective, which I'm sure is something that Positive East will also understand. But they're out there and they're there to help. So definitely get in touch.
No, that's great. A lot of information for our viewers. So next question. According to the statistics, LGBT plus people of color and people of trans and non-binary experience seem to be much more affected by all of the issues described in the documentaries. Why is that so?
Is it my turn? Yeah, it's my turn. I think there's sort of different reasons. I think there is this thing about lack of representation. So I think, as I was saying before, there has been historically a lack of diverse representation of LGBT plus people, meaning very few trans people have actually been in the mainstream, and very few LGBT people of color have been out in the mainstream as well. I think particularly for trans people, I'm not trans and I can't speak on behalf of trans people, obviously, but I think, I think that being trans in the UK at the moment is what it was like being gay in the UK in the sort of 60s and 70s. It's extremely difficult for trans people at the moment. The rhetoric that goes on, the constant debate about sort of trans lives and their worth. I think that, it's very obvious that if you're living in an environment where you are seeing your humanity be debated on TV or on the radio constantly, and you can't walk down the street without somebody pointing and staring, that is obviously going to have a profound impact on your mental well-being and your mental health. So I think for trans people, there are specific difficulties that come with being trans. I think for LGBT people of color, which is obviously something that I can speak to with a bit more authority from lived experience, I think for me, I remember when I first learned the concept of minority stress, right? So that, being a minority means that you have certain stresses in your life, and those stresses that are related to being a minority can kind of lead to poorer mental health. And I had this kind of profound realization after I come out, and I was, I guess in therapy, actually talking about the different, discriminations that I faced in my life. And I had this moment where I realized that actually, there was a point in time, when I first came out of the closet, I was like, hey guys, I'm gay. Like, let's do this. Like, let's go out. Let's, I was so excited and so happy to embrace a new community of people around me. And then, inevitably I experienced racism. And I was so taken aback by it, right? I was so taken aback by the fact that even in this community of people that I was supposed to belong with, there were people that, based on my ethnicity or perceived ethnicity often, I was excluded, right? So I think for LGBT people of color, you have this kind of like compound or like double minority stress, because even in the LGBT community or in queer spaces where you're supposed to belong, you're supposed to kind of feel like you can, be relaxed and whatever, you're still kind of a bit on high alert, because you do come across people who will be racist. It might not always be pointing at you and shouting racial slurs at you, but it might be someone fetishizing you, or it might be someone, saying something which is kind of an offhand comment, which is not super explicitly racist, but it has kind of racist undertones. And obviously there's also the flip scenario where in your ethnic community, they might be super homophobic, right? And a lot of Black and brown people face this as well, that, you can't be out in your ethnic community because it's not appropriate, or it's taboo, or it's looked down upon, or it would, lead to the disintegration of your safety and your well-being. So I think for me, it's that sort of compound minority stress, which really leads to the LGBT people of color facing more struggles. And you see this across the board. I mean, even statistically, I think Stonewall did a study in 2018 around this, which was quite an alarming study. And I mean, not alarming in the sense that it wasn't necessarily surprising, but it was a study that said like something like 52% of LGBT people had experienced depression in the last year. And on every single variable that they studied, when they looked at trans people and LGBT people of color, that number rose, right? So it was 52% of LGBT people had experienced depression. And then when you looked at, I think they use the term BAME, which I hate, but LGBT people of color or Black and brown people or whatever, when you say, it was like 63, like another 10% on there. So, you know, again, it's very complex. It's got lots of kind of contributing factors, but I think, you know, that was quite a long answer, actually. I was gonna say those few things that I said, that very long-winded answer is kind of what I think has contributed.
It was a perfect answer. I don't think it was that.
Thanks, Massimo. You have to say that, but I'll take it.
No, I think so. I think it's very interesting to understand this, and it's important for all of us to understand this issue. But I'll leave the word to Andre.
Well, I think Alexander's sort of articulated it, so I really don't think there is much I can add to that, actually. I mean, I was just going to say, I think that historically, the people that we're talking about now, so LGBT, people of color, trans and non-binary experience, and I think historically these groups are perhaps the most marginalized of all, and kind of marginalized within an already marginalized group, as it were. So I think people of color, trans, non-binary experience both the major societal discriminations that many LGBT people experience, as well as those additional, I liked what how you termed it, sort of minority stresses, characterized by assaults on your race or your identity choices. And those assaults can be social, environmental, verbal, non-verbal, as well as intentional, as well as unintentional. And I think, again, as Alexander said, you know, that it's a bit uncomfortable sometimes for the community to look at, the wider community, that this bias can come from within the LGBT community itself. You know, you can be Black and gay or trans or non-binary and still experience rejection or discrimination from the LGBT plus community, as well as the wider community. So, you know, you've got a lot on your plate already. And I think in addition to racism within or discrimination within LGBT plus communities, people of color, for instance, may also experience it's a great term called heterosexism within sort of racial or ethnic minority communities, specifically within their own kind of cultural communities. For example, in some African and Asian communities, these heterosexist attitudes are overwhelmingly prevalent. You know, and I've worked with LGBT people of color who actually tell me they fear for their lives in case they are outed, you know, because the dominating attitudes make no room whatsoever for difference or being gay of any kind. And, you know, there are these sort of attitudes of superiority, again, which can come from, you know, I've worked with gay men who sort of said, well, you know, God, at least I'm just gay, you know, thank God I'm not trans, wouldn't want to be that, you know, and stuff or whatever. And I don't think they're setting out to be intentionally sort of say hurtful or harmful things, but there's this kind of in society still that maybe white is right, might is right, you know, and that's the top of the pinnacle, and then under that everyone else has to sort of fight for their position. And I think at the bottom, if you are by, you know, an LGBT person of color or trans or something, you tend to sort of be at the bottom of the pile because, you know, people might say, look, you know, everyone's cool these days, it's fine for the gay community, but it's not fine for everybody within the gay community.
Yeah, that's very true. So we got to our last question. So how Olly Alexander describes his struggles with coming to terms with his homosexuality informs and reinforces also his character Richie Tozer in It's a Sin, the show that he was a protagonist of, and he had a big impact lately. So statistics say that LGBT plus individuals struggling with their mental health are more likely to get HIV or an STI in the course of their life. Do you think that working on the mental health of LGBT plus individuals would improve their sexual health as well, and how?
It's your turn, Andre.
Is it my turn?
I think so.
It's me. Oh, sorry. Okay, I think the definitive answer to, is yes to, good mental health is really, really important. And when you have good mental health, I think it's a bit like I was saying before, it's like a domino effect, and it spreads out into all the other sort of dimensions of your life. So I think with sort of good mental health, that kind of equals a healthy level of self-value, self-acceptance, and self-esteem. It doesn't come automatically. Sometimes we need support and help to help us to see we are valuable as individuals. But I think that if with good mental health, when I say it means that you'll be less likely to have sex, I mean based on a need for acceptance or approval, or as a means of escaping difficult feelings and emotions. And the more difficult those emotions and feelings will be, the greater the need to use maybe sex as an escape. Some people use drugs, some use alcohol, some use both. But I think good mental health brings about a healthy and helpful self-awareness that helps us wake us up from a sort of autopilot behavior. I don't even know I've got so low esteem, so I don't really know how to sort of get it. But what I do know is I can go and have sex and I can feel close. And so what's important is just going out and having sex. And I might take drugs. And if I take those drugs, they'll dissolve my boundaries. So I might even think I was going to have sex with one person, but I end up at a party and everyone's doing chems. And suddenly I've had sex with, I've worked with guys who sort of tell me about these experiences they have. And they say, I don't even know how many people I ended up having sex with. And they're full of sort of guilt and fear and worry afterwards and everything. So I think that good mental health is so important, because I think it's sort of, we use that awareness to ask ourselves, hold on a minute, what am I doing here? Why would I want to put myself at risk? And if I am putting myself at risk, what is behind that? What is it that I really need? Because good mental health enables us to ask ourselves questions. It enables us to check in with ourselves. That's what good counselling, good support from anybody does. It helps us into ourselves. We don't follow a set of rules. It means it connects us with our own guiding wisdoms. And I'm not being sort of like, you mustn't have sex. Of course you must have sex. It's part of our sort of lives, but we're just throwing ourselves into the maelstrom, as it were, and sort of having any kind of sex just as a sort of way of needing intimacy is going to increase those chances of STIs, of HIV, of all the stuff we know about, sort of thing. So I think that, good mental health is the first necessary in life, and again, I think this should be something that's taught at schools right from the beginning. As important it is to learn algebra and history, we should be being educated from an really early age about what it means to be healthy in mind and body and in our lives. Because when we tune into that, we will, without doubt, make different choices. We don't become prudes and say, I'm not going to have sex because I've got high self-esteem. Of course, but the sex we have can be loving, can be open and honest and intimate and joyful and beautiful. And we might not necessarily need, to take something to enable us to get to that point. So yes, what's my point here? I guess that, I think with good mental health is especially important for all the reasons we've discussed in in this talk, as it were, because like I say, being a human being is hard enough. Being a human being who might be LGBT or trans or non-binary or whatever is 100 times harder, especially, and 100 times harder again if you don't have support, if you're not able to access help or services, or you don't have the knowledge, sort of thing. So this is why I do the work I do. It's why I become a therapist, because I am such a pro and advocate of the utter importance of good mental health.
Yeah.
I mean, what can I add to that? Rather unsurprisingly, I feel like Andre smashed that one out of the park. I guess all that I would say perhaps is that I think that historically in our community, partly due to the HIV/AIDS epidemic and crisis, we've sort of segmented sexual health and mental health as these like separate beasts. I also think, you know, and this is a matter of opinion rather than fact. I think sometimes there has been a disproportionate focus on sexual health when actually, you know, particularly around things like chemsex, although it is a sexual health issue, it is also a mental health issue, right? These things are kind of different sides of the same coin. And I think that actually LGBT mental health is an area of kind of healthcare or LGBT healthcare, which is really under-resourced and really like not talked about enough. We've gotten to a point now where medicine and awareness has meant that like many, how do you say this? Much fewer, many less. I'm not really sure my English is starting to go at the end of the day, but you know, many less people are dying as a result of HIV and AIDS, right? But we have many people dying as a result of taking their own lives. LGBT people I'm talking about, right? And so when you actually look at the amount of people that, the amount of deaths that are occurring because of poor mental health in our community, I do think that mental health is something that we should be investing more in and talking more about. And I do think, yes, sexual health and mental health are of course linked. Of course they're interlinked. And anyone who kind of can't see that link, I'm like, well, you know, if your mental health is poor, of course you're likely to engage in sort of riskier sexual behavior. But also my friend Phil Samba, who I'm sure is not unfamiliar to positivist folk, has often talked about the kind of opposite, which is that actually when you are in control of your sexual health and when you feel, you know, better informed about things like PrEP or, you know, kind of what your options are around contraception, that can also be really helpful for your mental health, right? It can be really helpful that you kind of feel more in control of what you're doing and you know what the risks are and you sort of are more informed in that way. So I think it's always been symbiotic. I think we should talk and should invest more in LGBT mental health. But yeah, I'm just kind of blabbing because Andre smashed it. So,
but it's a good point that the relationship is reversed. It's not only mental health; it's good for sexual health, but also sexual health is good for mental health. It's a very good point. Anyway, this is all from us. And let me just remind you that if you need an HIV or STI test, free condoms or sexual health advice, if you're living with HIV and would like to access our peer support, advice, counseling services, or if you simply would like to support us with a donation, please visit our website, www.positivist.org.uk. And please fill in our evaluation form. You can find it in the link in the comments, and let us know if there are any films or subjects of discussions you would like to be covered. Technicolor will be back next month on Monday, the 10th of May at 6 p.m. and we will be discussing the film Breaking Fast and talk about interfaith relationships with new and exciting guests. So watch this space for more info. Bye, everyone, and thank you for joining us.
Bye.
Bye.